So welcome everyone to this panel, and thank you to our great speakers for being here with us today. So this panel will discuss the relations between China and Europe, mainly Western Europe, but Europe in general. And we will also have a little bit of a more, of a broader approach in also considering the strategy of the European Union and Europe in general towards the Indo-Pacific area, but with a more specific focus on China. Of course, this is a very crucial moment for relations between China and Europe, single European countries, as well as the European Union as an alliance system. Because in general, the past 10 years have seen relations becoming more and more tense. We have seen the relationship between the European Union and China, and also the UK and China, started to encompass a increasing security dimension. We have seen this, for example, with the introduction of the de-risking strategy. To further complicate the situation, of course, the current Trump administration has added a layer of complexity to the way the European Union can balance its relationship with China, and the UK as well can balance its relationship with China. Moreover, the EU and the UK have started to look with increasing interest at the broad Indo-Pacific area. They have started to show more interest and more determination into building strong partnerships with other countries in the Indo-Pacific. This has complicated the relations with China. And today we will discuss what can we expect for the future of relations between China and Europe, meaning the European Union and the UK mainly. So we will discuss this with this great panel. So we have Tis Dams, political theorist and senior research fellow at Signal Institute. And then we have Stefania Benaglia, EU foreign policy expert. And we have Marcin Gierowski, head of the Taiwan office of the European Values Center and fellow at Visegrad Institute. So just to kick off, I wanted to ask Tis, how do you see China's so-called re-emergence, or China becoming more prominent from economically and geopolitically, especially under Xi Jinping? How do you see this impacting the EU's and more broadly the Europe's evolution as a non-traditional geopolitical actor?
Thank you. And first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and speak with you all. So I was indeed with that question in mind, and also with the title of this panel in mind, what's next, invited to maybe zoom out a little and use the perspective of some of the research I've done over the past 2 years to just give a sense of where I think China and the EU are in their historic narratives. So let me explain a little bit what I mean by that. There's a beautiful quote by the Cambridge historian, Christopher Clark, "As gravity bends light, so power bends time." And the work I've been doing over the past 2 years is premised on the idea that great powers tend to project narratives, not just to tell their story and their history to the world, but also to dominate the sense of time in the international system. And this happens particularly in moments of great change, or at least in moments of perceived change of era, right? From the Second World War to the Cold War, or from the Cold War to the post-Cold War. And I think both China and the EU are signaling, as I think many of us in this room will also feel, that there is a current change of era. And at least the very fact that these actors believe that this is the case, I think, is a very pertinent fact. And the way they narrate these changes are very important, I think, for understanding their relationship to one another, but also for the way they are going to interact in the years to come. So for the EU, there's a very, the second election of Donald Trump to the US presidency has given rise also to a very dominant temporal metaphor, rearming Europe. And that metaphor in and of itself breaks with many dogmas, I would say, of post-Cold War Europe and even the post-World War II Europe, which was identified as a peace project, as a project of disarmament. And so this sort of directly contradicts that long arch of European history and European integration. Xi Jinping uses a very different metaphor to talk about the present, and he's done so for a number of years now, but he has done so incessantly, persistently and consistently since 2022 in particular. He talks about the present as great changes unseen in a century. And this is also, I think, a very interesting metaphor and in many ways a euphemism. And I would just like to give a sense of where China and Xi Jinping and this metaphor is coming from, how that interacts with the current moment in Europe's transformation, to answer that question, what's next and where are we now? In many ways, I think European countries and the EU are entering a time that CCP and PRC leaders have been narrating, propagandizing, and even prophesizing for a long time, right? This is a very uncomfortable truth, but I think it is very pertinent to what is currently happening, or what we're seeing, the end of the post-Cold War, and what China at least has for long been telling as the inevitable advent of multipolarity. So just to illustrate, let's go back to the end of the Cold War, to 1989, and see how the different players at that time narrated that change in era. To Bush and to Helmut Kohl, so Bush Sr. and to Helmut Kohl, the events from the fall to the Berlin Wall to the dissolution of the Soviet Union meant a unified Germany in a disarmed Europe, and a Europe as a whole and free as an exemplar for the unipolar world order. And George Bush Sr. said this at the UN very eloquently: the world must now become like Europe, whole and free. There was a different European narrative. Mitterrand and Gorbachev for a little while tried to use that moment to forge a European third power, as de Gaulle had also always wanted and again failed. Deng didn't understand 1989 as the end of the Cold War. He very explicitly said on November 28 to an audience of party members, this is the next chapter in the Cold War. We are the last bastion against the US empire, and our main threat is the American story. As he had just seen protesters calling to that story on Tiananmen Square, calling for Chinese democracy. So he didn't leave the Cold War, he entered a next chapter, and the CCP and the Chinese state started to transform itself accordingly. So that sense of diverging sense of time, disarmament in Europe, and reorientation of the ongoing war in China has, I think, been very influential in how these two powers, or these two actors, have evolved in the meantime. And I won't go into all detail, but multipolarity was very significant to that. Months later, in 1990, Deng already said, the unipolar moment will be an interlude, multipolarity is coming, and when it is there, China must and will inevitably become a pole and must claim preeminent authority to speak for that new age. So from 1990 onwards, China was preparing for American collapse and the advent of multipolarity, and the use of collective identity-based geopolitics as a way to stand strong in that new era. At the very moment that Europe decided to reverse or do the opposite on all three of those issues, and refound itself as the European Union accordingly. So I think Xi Jinping is very much a product of that preparation. So I'm skipping many steps. But certainly from 2008 onwards, financial crisis, there was a growing sense in the foreign policy elite of China that that decline, long prophesied, was now beginning of US empire, to use the terminology. And this is actually the time also where this metaphor of great changes unseen in a century comes from. It was coined by a Chinese intelligence strategist, wrote a bestseller, very interesting. And it's a euphemism for a number of huge developments, also the Fourth Industrial Revolution, but also for the collapse of US empire, the inevitable collapse of US empire, as Yuan Peng would have it. And so when Xi came to power, he started to transform Chinese power again accordingly. Under centralized rule, we know the story, what he has done to, or what his reign has meant for Chinese power. But also he started to push the timelines of Chinese politics. He started to set deadlines for this great rejuvenation. 2021, alleviate absolute poverty. 2035, become a global leader in technology. 2049, become a global leader in composite national strength. 2049 as the sort of deadline for that great shift in power. And I think if we're talking about when is now for these two actors, for China and the US, or for China and the EU, to a great extent, to Xi, this is a moment in which that long prophecy / propaganda project of Chinese leaders far before him is materializing, but far too soon in relation to the plan or the narrative he had set certainly in the first term of his reign. Multipolarity seems to be here, not in the least place because indeed President Donald Trump in his second term seems to be relinquishing not necessarily the material aspects of US power, but the authority and the instruments of narrative power that the US had built up in the post-Second World War. Very symbolically important, I think, are the defunding of Voice of America, which was such a hallmark of exactly what the Chinese have always feared most about US power, the power of its story, but also the sort of blacklisting of people associated with the Global Engagement Center, which was used by Biden as a strong suit of countering Chinese and Russian narratives. So in many ways, Trump is materializing or performing that doom prophecy that the Chinese have long premised their rise on. And that is at once a moment of impending victory, but also a moment of great existential stress. Xi Jinping's domestic economic upheaval is just underway. We see frantic purges in the PLA leadership, also I think a sign of great uncertainty. And Europe plays a very important role in making this hasty transition. Europe is a vital resource for at least also that economic transition that Xi Jinping has in mind, and for surviving its own victory. And I think that will premise a lot of the Chinese posture towards the EU in the time to come, that it needs the EU as a resource to survive its own victory and to make this transition, but also fails to see, and understandably so, the EU as another pole in that multipolar world order. And this raises really, I think, fundamental constitutional and political questions for the EU itself. How to organize its spokesmanship in a multipolar world based on, at least as one very important aspect of power, collective identity politics, which the EU as the Union, and certainly the EU institutions, primarily the Commission, have always prided themselves on really overstepping, of not doing. So just to shorten my introduction somewhat, I think in terms of non-traditional security, this projection of narrative power and thereby claiming a right to speak and to determine the rules of engagement for a new time in geopolitics has been very central to what China has been trying to accomplish for the past decades. and is now a very new but very pertinent fact for the EU to get its head around. If we want to co-write those rules of engagement, we need to convince China of the fact that there is a pole, that there are leaders with the authority to speak on behalf of Europe, and not just the EU, but Europe, including, for instance, also Ukraine, but certainly also the UK, and that this authority is strong enough to demand China invite us at tables and vice versa. So this is, I think, a very different challenge for the EU and for China, but both are grappling with, indeed, what's next, a new age of doing geopolitics for which the rules of engagement haven't been written yet. And sadly, I would say for Europe, China seems to have the home advantage because it's been propagandizing this world for, I think, since Sun Yat-sen, but that's an academic matter to discuss, but certainly since Deng Xiaoping in 1989. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yes, I'd like to come back to this later, especially about the concept of the EU as a whole, because of course there is the whole bilateral dimension of single member states that complicates that a little bit, right? And you mentioned as well, which is I think is crucial, the fact that the EU is going through a moment of great change in terms of, you mentioned the Rearm Europe, right? In terms of having this heavy focus on security and even traditional security in this case, right? But of course, I see this also in the relationship with China, especially with the, in terms of non-traditional security, with the whole de-risking strategy. And as part of this de-risking strategy, the EU has an alliance system, but also single member states and also the UK as well, have attempted to strengthen their relationships with other partners in the Indo-Pacific. And of course, this has complicated even further to balance relationships with China. And so I wanted to ask Stefania, on this point, how would you assess the EU's current approach to the Indo-Pacific and specifically the Indo-Pacific strategy? And how do you see that, if you see that impacting the EU's current strategy towards China as well?
Thank you very much. I will absolutely answer that question, but if you allow me, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity of sharing a couple of thoughts. I would like to first indeed enter into this discussion because it was fundamental for me as well, because while thinking how to structure the comments today, I really thought of what is the key question ahead of us. And exactly, the EU is, I have a little bit more pessimistic way of looking at it, is a little bit pretty much borderline irrelevant in the eyes of China. Sorry for starting with the optimistic view. I will get on the optimism later on. It's at best, in good days, it's a trading partner. As you say, it's a resource, and to be seen if the resource is only to be used, or if it is, but it is not a partner. It is not a strategic partner. And this is also being observed because, and this, there's a degree of fault in this also within the EU, because the level and the number of track 2 and track 1.5 dialogues with China has been dramatically diminished in the last few years. And this led to a situation of increasing misunderstanding and misinterpretation simply by the mere fact that there's less discussion, there's less confrontation, there's less exchanges. And of course, both are complex actors, and you can only read your partner by having a enhanced exposure. By diminishing the exposure and the exchanges, we have now a situation where the misunderstanding and the misunderstanding is really happening. Now, this may not be the best, but this may be not crucial, but we are exactly in a moment, an historical moment, amongst all the other changes. There's this, I call it security emancipation of the EU. The EU is going towards a rearmament without necessarily referring to the specificities of rearm the program, but really the concept of emancipating itself, something that has been indeed discussing. But this doesn't happen in a vacuum. How do the others read that? How do the others understand that? And while right now the discussion is very much internal, we look at it regionally or transatlantic relation. But how does China read that? And in a situation where there's so little exchanges, and again, here I stress the track 2 discussion, so the civil society or the track 1.5, not the official talks, because of course the EU has official security discussion with China, but that is a completely different track. It's not what I'm referring right now. I'm referring to really the awareness and reading each other's intention and making sure that your message is conveyed in the right way. And the other question is also, what is the EU message on this, actually? What does the EU want to say to China? What is our message? So this is, for me, is really an existential discussion, because what we are potentially, if this is not taken seriously, what we are potentially about to unleash is a domino effect, because, of course, they didn't drop the word nuclear, which is the next big discussion that we have in front of us. What about nuclear deterrence? We have been living a few decades of shaky equilibrium, but still we had it. What if we open up the whole discussion about nuclear umbrella within the EU? How does that happen, et cetera, et cetera? What would be the reaction for the rest of the world? Are we sure that we are not about to unleash a new wave of nuclear armament, of which we know only the beginning, but we do not know the consequences? So this is very much an important question that the EU needs to discuss internally, have a good idea of what kind of outcome it wants to have, and needs to have a constructive discussion with China on this topic. But going to your question indeed, how do I see the EU policy in the Indo-Pacific? And how do other Asian partners actually see the EU in the Indo-Pacific? Because, okay, in 2021, we had the Indo-Pacific strategy that was adopted. This is September. The world looked like, I don't know if actually you remember what the world looked like in September 2021. Very different from the world of today, extremely different. And what happened since the adoption of the Indo-Pacific strategy in the Indo-Pacific? Well, in a way, not a lot, because of course the whole geostrategic attention got reshifted towards the region, and in a way something. So trade-wise, there have been a degree of FTAs that have been either reopened for negotiation, some have been concluded. Of course, the one with India is still pending, which is maybe the major ones that have been, hampering unimportant relations. But there's the political objective of concluding it by the end of the year, so maybe we're going to the end of it. Another important development are the security and defense partnerships that have been signed with Japan and South Korea, and they are under discussion with India as well. The question there, which is actually, if I can draw from a question from the previous panel, what about reciprocity? But in this case, I would actually frame it vice versa. What is the reciprocity in security and defense matter that the EU is actually putting on the table in these SDPs, which is, to me, unclear. And which is also, to me, unclear what would be the frame, because indeed, and I agree very much what was said in the previous panel, we should not look at the EU power projection in the Indo-Pacific only in hard power terms, because that would be a very peculiar way of looking at the EU intervention, the EU power projection. It needs to be much, much broader. When it comes to India, which is, there have been a great degree of institutional development, especially with Japan and Korea, but also with India. Since the Indo-Pacific strategy in 2021, we're now about to have a new strategy for India that will be adopted as well by the end of the year. So let's see if there will be, again, an indication of what do we want to do with India, because indeed, I completely share that India is absolutely a key power and partner in the Indo-Pacific, because the way India acts can change everything. And for a little bit of optimism, I would actually like to conclude with an areas where I do see some opportunity for opening up a discussion with China. And this is in a context which may not be very optimistic in the beginning, but the optimism comes up. And I'm referring to development cooperation. Development cooperation globally is about to change dramatically, not only for the withdrawal of the USAID, but also the EU that is shifting its idea from the EU that of course, this is fundamental because the EU is the largest, by large degree, is the largest development donor of the world. So what the EU does has a huge impact in the world when it comes to development cooperation, and is now shifting entirely the philosophy behind development cooperation from the traditional one to a connectivity investment-driven, so global gateway kind of development. Now, while we can open up the discussion about global gateway and look at how it goes, the point I want to make in this context is in all of this shift, there is one area that remains structurally unlooked at, which are the fragile and conflict-afflicted areas that before were covered by development cooperation, and right now, because we have a completely different kind of development, are left in a vacuum. So the question is, perhaps also making use of another extremely good tool that I think we have at hand, which is the PGII, the G7 connectivity initiative that also has with it Japan, the UK, the US, so not only the EU, but a much larger pool of partners. Can we have a conversation? And of course, when I say having a conversation doesn't mean agreeing, but it means at least have a conversation with China about how to do development in conflict-affected and fragile areas where at the moment there's absolutely a vacuum and nobody is actually looking at how to intervene there, which of course is different from humanitarian aid. There's just to spell out the difference. So this is actually the positive note I wanted to conclude you with, that the question is, by talking development cooperation declined as connectivity, can the EU strengthen its perception and the perception that China has of the EU and be, therefore being instrumental to addressing the communication gap and avoid a scenario of global arms race that nobody wants to have?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stefania. We'll definitely come back to this as well, and also on the difficulties in actually having a conversation, with China. When you said that, I immediately thought of the EU-China forum, I think in 2022, when there were two main points to discuss. It was the war in Ukraine and I think imbalance in trade relations between China and the EU, and Joseph Borrell defined the forum as a dialogue of the deafs because of the inability of the two parties to actually sit and have a conversation in a cooperative way. But also speaking of misunderstandings with China, of course a contentious point in the relationship has always been, and especially during the Xi Jinping's leadership, has been Taiwan. So we have seen also instances, for example, the case of Lithuania in 2020, if I'm not mistaken, or 21, when Lithuania tried to open an official representation office of Taiwan, and then China, of course, behaved in a very coercive way, and that caused a lot of problems with the European Union. So I wanted to ask Martin, how do you see EU-Taiwan relations developing in this moment where balancing the relationship with China has become so difficult? It has been so difficult for a while for the European Union.
Thank you very much for your question, and thank you to the Center for Geopolitics for having me. In my remarks, I would like to touch upon 5 main points. Firstly, the notion that Taiwan belongs to the broader umbrella of European engagements with the so-called Greater China region. Then shed some light on my perception of heterogeneity in what it means that Europe engages with Taiwan. So differentiating between engagements at the level of EU as a bloc, individual member states, and then also the UK. Then also contextualize this discussion from a triangular perspective, shedding some light on engagements between European stakeholders and Taiwan in the era of decline, or at least tension, in transatlantic ties. then a pragmatist turn in EU's approach to the Indo-Pacific, and also a pragmatist turn in Taipei's own foreign policy, and then also conclude on a hopefully positive note of windows of opportunity. So I understand that we're having this conversation and you're posing these very important and timely questions in the context of unpacking Europe's relations with Greater China. But I think that this concept of Greater China really merits a very critical interrogation, because while Taiwan arguably belongs to the Sinitic cultural and civilizational sphere, the concept of Greater China is, in my opinion, not very useful as a tool of political analysis. So yes, there is the Sinitic cultural sphere connection between China and Taiwan, but that connection also exists between China and Singapore, whose sovereignty is not questioned as much as sovereignty of Taiwan. And it also exists between overseas Chinese communities in places like San Francisco or London. And this notion of Greater China is at the level of construction of narratives, to me, dangerously close to the efforts by the PRC to project its Huayuquan while exercising legal warfare and trying to, for instance, distort the meaning of the UN General Assembly Resolution number 2758 to distort the meaning of one China policies that most countries around the world have defined, including the EU as a whole, including EU member states, including the UK, but which is not synonymous with the one China principle. And I believe that this is really important, and talking about UN 2758 might sound extremely technical, but in recent months we have actually seen European legislatures speak up very overtly against this constructivist distortion or against this tool of Chinese legal warfare. For instance, the European Parliament passed a resolution condemning China's malign distortion of UN 2758 in October 2024. The Czech Senate did so exactly a month ago on April 29th. So this distinction is extremely important because while there is absolutely no appetite in Europe to do away with one China policies, and there is no appetite to recognize independence of Taiwan, which would be absolutely counterproductive because there is no agreement on the form that formal independence should take even within the Taiwanese population, whose agency should be respected the most in these conversations. One China policies do not prescribe informal or be it substantive ties with Taiwan or participation of Taiwan in international fora. And the second point is that within Europe, we have also seen growing willingness of key stakeholders to dehyphenate relations with Taiwan and consider Taiwan as a like-minded partner in its own terms and not merely a subset, a sore wound within the broader context of relations with China. And here, at least within the context of the European Union's relations with Taiwan, the European Parliament has played a key role, for instance, in 2021, when it adopted its first ever standalone report on the European Union's relations with Taiwan. Then in 2022, in its report on relations with the Indo-Pacific, and then also through several resolutions. One of the key pragmatic calls for collaboration was actually related to Global Gateway, upon which you touched in your own remarks, when members of the European Parliament called on the European Commission to identify ways to act on synergies that exist between the Global Gateway initiative and Taiwan's new southbound policy that targets South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Australia, Aotearoa, New Zealand. So moving to my second point about heterogeneity, I think that when we try to understand dynamics that have recently emerged between Europe and Taiwan, it is really important to remind ourselves, even though we are in Europe and we are a predominantly European panel, that Europe is hardly a monolith. In some ways, post-Brexit UK is an example and a source of blueprints for institutionalization of these informal but substantive ties with Taiwan. And here I'm thinking specifically about the enhanced trade partnership, which can effectively serve as a basis for different types of sectoral agreements in the economic domain that the EU is now considering as it seeks to find a consensual way to institutionalize its ties with Taiwan. So ETP here serves as a really strong blueprint, particularly for promoting digital trade, cooperation on renewable energy, and realization of net zero objectives. Then we have seen, you mentioned Lithuania, and Lithuania has clearly presented itself as an early stalwart of a new opening in relations between Taiwan and Central Eastern European countries in particular. So around 2020, Central Eastern European countries entered a very new era of its relations with the Indo-Pacific and with China. That was a time when many countries started in the eastern part of the continent started to realize that promises of lucrative economic deals that China made after Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013 were not coming to fruition. Intelligence services of many Central Eastern European countries also pointed to security vulnerabilities of some investment projects that China was trying to pursue. For example, in Lithuania, the deep sea port of Klaipėda. And also at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, China was hardly seen as a trustworthy, like-minded partner, given the lack of transparency on its part, as Europe was grappling with the health crisis. So since 2020, we have observed a second wave of openness towards Taiwan and Central Eastern Europe. The first wave came in the early 1990s when either newly independent or newly sovereign, free from Muscovite influence countries in Central Eastern Europe tried to identify new paradigms for their engagements with the world, including with Asia. So, but even then, within Central and Eastern Europe, the engagement with Taiwan happens at different levels. And if you are interested specifically in Taiwan-CE relations, I would encourage you to consult a 2023 report by the Central European Institute for Asian Studies titled Beyond the Dumpling Alliance. I'm the author of the country chapter for Poland, but this publication suggested a framework for understanding these different levels of engagement with Taiwan by categorizing countries in the CEE region as vanguards, pragmatists, and laggards in pursuing ties with Taiwan. So these levels of engagement really differ, and if you're interested in operationalization of these three tiers, I'm sure we can touch upon it in the Q&A. But then to bring this conversation back to the EU level, I believe that understanding the labyrinthine EU bureaucracy, which also includes different mechanisms for decision-making in different areas of EU policymaking, is important to understanding some of the challenges that Europe as a whole encounters in its efforts to recalibrate engagements with Taiwan. Specifically, common foreign and security policy is governed by the principle of unanimity, and therefore a discussion that is particularly pertinent to the future of Europe's engagements with Taiwan, but also with China, is whether Ursula von der Leyen, in her second term as the Commission President, will be successful in pushing the envelope on switching the mode of decision-making for CFSP from unanimity to qualified majority voting. So moving on to this triangular perspective, Taiwan, EU, and the United States. Washington has clearly been a very important source of momentum for many of these new engagements with Taiwan. And in my previous point, I highlighted that Central Eastern European countries have really put a lot of effort in identifying spaces for productive engagements with Taiwan, and it has to be borne in mind that the US was often a catalyst for these engagements. Once again, to look at the case of Lithuania, when China removed Lithuania from its customs system after Vilnius permitted the opening of the Taiwanese representative office in Vilnius, US Exim Bank tried to help the private sector very quickly by opening a $300 million credit line for affected enterprises. Additionally, the United States since 2015 has been one of the official co-sponsors of the Global Cooperation and Training Framework, a platform which currently has 5 official members: Taiwan, United States, Australia, Japan, and most recently Canada, which is a platform of workshops and capacity building initiatives that allow Taiwan to platform its experiences amid its exclusion from international fora. And here the US has been trying to work with its strongest partners on the continent to bring GCTF to Europe as well. The first GCTF in Europe was actually held in the Czech Republic. And then additionally, the first speaker also mentioned the closure of the Global Engagement Center, termination of programs such as CPIF that provided resources to civil society also in Central Eastern Europe to promote engagements with Taiwan as an alternative to China. So, for instance, a source of constructive capital rather than Chinese corrosive capital. And this is a lingering question, whether Europe will be willing and able to maintain this momentum without US support. Then there's also the question of strategic autonomy. Many of you might remember controversial comments of Emmanuel Macron aboard his aircraft on the way back to Paris after meetings in China, when he said that Europe was not going to be a vassal of the United States, and he refused further engagements in confrontations over Taiwan. So this also exposes some of the internal rifts in Europe. CEE countries that amid very close, just physically close presence of threats from Russia rely on US security guarantees perhaps more than many of the Western states, and therefore might be more willing to engage with the US paradigm of engagements with the Indo-Pacific than countries, than other member states such as France. Moving forward, so what can sustain the progress that we have seen in the last 5 years or so? I believe that there is an alignment between Taiwan and Europe in their pragmatist shifts in definitions of foreign policy. So under Tsai Ing-wen, and particularly with Joseph Wu at the helm of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Taipei, there was a very strong emphasis on normative foreign policy. In the spirit of the English school, we could argue that Taiwan was trying to use normative appeals to move up the hierarchy of the global community. But under the unprecedented third DPP administration, and with Lin Jialong at the helm of the foreign ministry, amid his efforts to create a tangible legacy, there is a new paradigm in Taipei, a so-called 综合外交, or comprehensive or integrated diplomacy, that doesn't do away with references to like-mindedness and shared values, but also prioritizes economic engagements. And here, the announcement by Taipei that it will establish new industrial manufacturing zones in Japan, the Czech Republic, and also one of the new Southbound policy target countries, very likely Thailand, demonstrates this new attention on what Taiwan can tangibly deliver to its partners. That is also a realization that amid democratic backsliding and authoritarian turn in a lot of partner countries of Taiwan, the contenders will ask the question, can the state deliver? Can democracy put bread on the table? So Taiwan is not doing away with its promotion of democracy, but also is responding to these calls for more tangible, more easily perceptible and consumable outcomes of cooperation. So what are some of the windows of opportunity? I once again would like to emphasize that engagements with Taiwan do not have to mean crossing China's red lines. They don't have to mean any form of reversal or departure from one China policies, and they can be very pragmatic and very technical. So some of the areas where there's a lot of alignment and a lot of unfulfilled potential include, for instance, work on green energy and realization of net zero objectives. Taiwan is quite dramatically lagging behind its own goals. By 2025, Taiwan was hoping to produce at least 20% of energy from renewable sources. In 2024, that figure was barely above 11%. So here, Europe, with its experience in proliferating renewable technologies has a lot of space for maneuvers, for instance, in underexplored technologies such as geothermal. There's also a lot of space to enhance cooperation on agricultural trade, and the EU has explicitly mentioned agriculture as one of the areas where this potential is underutilized. For instance, agriculture came up as one of the two main issues in economic relations between Taiwan and the EU in Valdis Dombrovskis' then European Commission's Vice President remarks to the European Parliament in December 2023. So Europe could also make a step towards Taiwan, for example, by pursuing agreements on mutual recognition of organic certifications or protected geographic origin. And last but not least, the March 2025 decision by the European Commission to announce the new preparedness union strategy also opens new avenues for pragmatic cooperation with Taiwan on resilience building and preparedness. There's already a foundation for the EU to build upon. For instance, Taiwanese experts, including those affiliated with the National Fire Agency under the Ministry of Interior, have participated in global workshops hosted by DG ECHO, the Directorate General under the European Commission. So cooperation should focus on tangible deliverables and on areas of mutual concern.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I actually have like a lot of questions. I'll start like asking questions to the panel, and of course, like we can open up the discussion to the floor. So going back to what Thies was mentioning about the EU as a pole, right? As well as like this moment of a change, you mentioned like Xi Jinping's, quote about this moment of great change, and I absolutely agree with what you said. I want to ask you, how much do you think, how much is this related to Xi Jinping's approach? Because you also mentioned that Xi Jinping is also a product of and his approach towards the EU and like China's relationship to the EU is also a product of what happened before. So you mentioned the 2008 global financial crisis and China's shift in perceiving the Western model of development, of course. So how much do you think these approach that Xi Jinping has, this increased assertiveness that is often referred to as a problem in relations between China and the European Union, has to do with an element of novelty that Xi Jinping brought, and how much instead do you think this is like an ethos that precedes his tenure and that he just inherited and developed? And also I wanted to ask you in regard to what you mentioned about the EU as a pole in this multipolar world. How do you consider the bilateral dimension of single member states, and their relations with China in this case, but more general with actors where the EU aims at having a unified strategy? How can the EU be a pole if it's fragmented internally? And then I wanted to ask Stefania, so you mentioned, and I very much agree on this, like how the first problem we had, like Europe has in framing its relationship with China is how to have a constructive discussion with China, right? And you said how there are different fields where this is absolutely necessary, such as development in fragile areas, especially after what happened with USAID. So what I want to ask you is, like, do you think this is still possible? Is there still space to build constructive engagement with China? And do you think the EU has the capacity to do that, even in a critical moment like this, when one of the, if not the most important partnership, so the partnership with the US, is in such a critical moment? And also you mentioned the global gateway, and I wanted to ask you, what do you think happened with that? because of course when it was announced, it sounded like a great thing, right? It seemed like it was actually providing an alternative to the BRI in certain areas of the world, but then it kind of like deflated, I would say. So what do you think happened, and do you see any future for the global gateway, or do you think it's just dead, basically? And then to Marcin, you mentioned how, like, within Europe is important to consider how to develop a relationship with a partner, like-minded partner as Taiwan on its own, and how different European actors are starting to really think in this way, right? But then you also mentioned, and I agree with this, that Europe is hardly a monolith, you know. So I wanted to ask you again, is it possible then to develop this shared approach towards Taiwan as a partner on its own within a very fragmented Europe? So maybe we can start with this.
Yes, thank you. Yes, to start with your first question, is she a product of a reorientation of the party that happened before him, or the author of the great changes that he's professing now? It's a little bit of both, but really in the first instance, he's a product of a strategic reorientation that happened within the party elite and that preceded his coming to power. At least there's, I think, short of being in those rooms, plenty of evidence to see that a shift was happening within the party elite from 2008 onwards, in particular, and it's not just, and I highlighted the factor of a perceived sense of American decline or impending American decline in my introduction, but there was, I think, a myriad of reasons or of factors, and particularly insecurities in the party at that point, also very much importantly domestic, and in relation to party organization itself, that converged on a sense of at least renewed need for centralized leadership, for more assertive foreign policy. What happened from 2012 onwards is that the protagonist invented to tell that story, of course, became a large driver of that story as well. So now I think certainly is both. It's an interplay between the party having chosen this path to survive and reinvent itself, but Xi Jinping also needing to protect its own position within that system, and reinforcing that vicious cycle of centralization, etc. But I would say most significantly, Xi Jinping is in also in the substance of how he narrates his reign, a product of the leaders before him, and of a reorientation that preceded the leadership switch of 2012. And it's very important, I think, to understand Xi as that, because that also informs what we see him do as a symptom really of a survival strategy by the CCP, rather than merely a dictator run amok. So I think that's a very important distinction if we want to gauge in a nuanced and more fine-grained way what choices the CCP makes in that respect. So yeah, short answer, Xi is a product. And I could go into depth in the reasons for believing that, but I think that's the short of it. Then the question about how on earth can the EU become a pole, or be a pole, or act as one, if it is at the same time really an arena for states to compete, cooperate, etc. And I think there's more things, there's at least two answers to that, and neither really gives a solution to the problem. And the first is that the EU institutions, as they are now, have great difficulty in representing Europe as a historic and geographic entity. And that's a fundamental question that the EU cannot escape. And there's many reasons for this, and Brexit is one that makes it very obvious, or the loss of the UK makes it very obvious that in a geopolitical context, if you talk about the geopolitical power of Europe, and you're not talking about the UK, something's going wrong, right? So a big part of the story is missing. And so you see that, and this has happened throughout history of the EU, of the European communities, but arguably even before that, that in moments of not necessarily existential crisis, but moments where Europe as a community, as a geography and as a history is spoken to, whether through a security threat or in another sense, a number of these older powers, for lack of a better word, of used to be great powers, step up and tend to speak for Europe. So I think Starmer understands this, right? And he understands that he needs Macron for this. And I think actually the Germans have been very understandably and very rightly so very reluctant to join in. But Metz has a sense of the states needing to act in union as Europe, not as the EU institutions, but as Europe in moments of geopolitical crisis. And that's, I think, also an answer to the second question. So how on earth could, if the EU in and of itself cannot do it, then the EU can be more supportive of member states and be smarter in supporting member states in doing this. For instance, and I think it is already starting to do things like this, by creating workarounds that member states can use in cooperation with the EU institutions to, for instance, project a positive image of the EU abroad without or short of a complete unanimity in the European Council of Heads of State. And I think actually, not to steal your thunder because you're really the Global Gateway expert, but Global Gateway is a very promising vehicle still for that. And especially the so-called Team Europe approach, where member states, groups of member states supported by EU institutions can act as Europe and project that brand, that image to the world, is actually very promising. I think it's a promise because if you're comparing BRI and Global Gateway, what becomes obvious is that BRI really started just as a storytelling project. Xi Jinping demarcating his sphere of influence between Kazakhstan and Indonesia in the first instance, showing his arena, telling China's history from that arena, and the material policies, the economic cooperation followed from that. It was really started as that sort of big geoeconomic storytelling project. I think Global Gateway is doing it the other way around. If it's going to do something like that, it started with lots of projects and with the material base. It now needs to figure out how to tell a narrative on behalf of Europe using that presence. And that's very typical, I think, of the EU. And it's each actor does it in its own way. But I think for long we have considered in Europe sort of the story as the cherry on top, but it's half the cake. And we're starting to see that now, I think, in Global Gateway. That's one of the ways, I think, that it's a very promising vehicle to at least project that narrative. And the last point I wanted to add is it's now very, in a way, appealing to see these strongman leaders on the world stage representing their histories and their communities and their states, Xi Jinping and Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, and thinking that in some way the EU should emulate that to meet their challenge. Whereas, of course, the plain fact is that the EU certainly cannot. French presidents have always been very good at somewhat imitating that, but even Macron cannot do that anymore. But also, these actors have their own deep insecurities that are very much related to their systems of power and the difficulties that come with representing their communities. And also, I mean, Chinese history and American history too are full of examples where these actors have been able to project very successfully, I think, a narrative and therefore influence real material great power relations at a time where there were deep insecurities or even moments of crisis within each of those states. Zhou Enlai was very successful at projecting narratives while Mao Zedong was ready to cut his throat, almost. Benjamin Franklin, maybe going back too far, was very successful in convincing the old European empires that a promising dominion was standing up to a bright tomorrow in America, when his Congress didn't really believe in it that strongly, and there wasn't a state to speak of. And so there's a great deal of fake it till you make it that we can use, and that we can learn from moments in history and these other great powers that we can use to sort of meet their challenge, short of making a farcical imitation of strongman politics that Europe, I think, can't believably emulate. Thank you.
Thank you. We can move to Stefania.
Thanks. Yes, I think I will answer a little bit in shuffled order, because I certainly pick up from the Global Gateway. Yes, and it is not a matter of what it does. The EU usually is quite good in saying how and what, but very bad in saying why it does something. And that is the embedded flaw of the EU. You never understand what is the big picture that the EU has. And this, I would link it up with also the unanimity and qualified majority voting. Of course, the unique projection of yourself outside. This is all linked. Now, that said, Global Gateway, it is very much alive and maybe not kicking, but still alive. The amount of projects is not the problem. The problem is making a narrative that links them up and show why they're doing what they're doing. At the end of the day, the EU knows how to do connectivity. The European Union is based on connectivity. I mean, the whole Erasmus, the whole moving around Europe, the whole creation of Europe. So it's not about doing connectivity that the EU doesn't know how to do it. It's the why are you doing that? What is the political meaning of choosing this area, this project, instead of that one, of that project? What is the transparency? Why are you going one direction instead of the other one? And this is the work in progress. Now, it was a little bit silent because, as again, very European way, it was institution building. So it was looking inside, putting its things in order to make sure that you have the whole forum that talks with the right forum, etc., etc. This is what has been done until now. It is true that since especially the last hearing of the commissioner, which already dates 6 months, so by now we should hear something more, this is exactly the expectation. Now you did your internal homework, do the external. But this is very much the expectation. Now, if in 3-4 years' time we don't see the external, then I would take a different conclusion. But for now, I am still very optimistic. And why did I link it up with the discussion about, EU having one voice versus the member states having their own voice, which is not always in synchro? You mentioned the qualified majority voting. Of course, it's complicated, but as usual, I have my optimistic way reading, which is deadline which is imposed, not so much with the political end of the mandate, but rather the enlargement. The enlargement, whenever we will have a date for the enlargement, that will by necessity push towards addressing this question, because we need to have an idea before the enlargement, because we certainly can't have it after, because things will simply be more complicated. So that discussion will happen the day when we will have a date for the enlargement, and think that therefore we will have a push there. I'm quite rather confident about that. And then the third discussion, has the EU the capacity to sit down and talk with China about how to look at development in conflict afflicted? Well, I would say yes, because the EU has the legitimacy. The EU is the largest donor of development by no second, because the second one being the US has half of what the EU does. So it's, the legitimacy that the EU have is huge. Does the EU know how to leverage that? That's a different question. So the EU has the potential of sitting down and thinking and, say also acknowledging what didn't work, because certainly, we can have a discussion, and obviously traditional development had its flaws and shortcomings, obviously. Global Gateway, and again, the transformation of development is an attempt to go in a different direction with pros and cons, clearly. And I don't know if it is 50-50 or 20-80 in which direction. But can we have a discussion? And again, having a discussion doesn't mean agreeing. The point on sitting at the table and putting the elements on the table and how do we see the elements is already beneficial.
Okay, and Martin?
Of course, you're asking a €1 million question here, but I think that a good starting point for us would be to realize that when it comes to attempts to develop a more unified EU strategy for engagements with Taiwan, we are not starting from scratch, because there is already an institutional framework for these engagements, both at the level of EU as a whole. The EU is represented in Taiwan by the European Economic and Trade Office, which functions de facto as an EU delegation, as well as at the level of member states. So out of the 27, 17 have some form of representation in Taiwan, and the size, the naming differs quite significantly. You have the French office staffed with more than 70 people. Then you have the representative office of Luxembourg that has 2 people in it, but member states are also present in Taiwan. So this means that there is already a foundation to build upon. Additionally, there is also a foundation in the form of institutionalized dialogues on topics ranging from industrial policy to human rights. And the characterization of these dialogues as technical, as pragmatic, is very core here. So, of course, representation on the EU side in these dialogues might be lower than in the case of some other partners. So, for instance, for the human rights dialogue, the EU is usually represented at the level of the head of division, which is slightly disproportionate, as on the Taiwanese side. That's usually a member of the cabinet of ministers, a member of the executive UN. Nevertheless, these dialogues are happening, and there is space for expanding these types of exchanges by putting in place dialogues in new thematic areas, for instance, resilience building or preparedness, along the lines of my opening remarks. And I also believe that amid this pragmatic turn that I mentioned earlier, it is important to recognize how engagements with Taiwan can facilitate implementation, but also evaluation and potential redefinition of existing objectives of the European Union's external action. And even though the EU is not a monolith, the 27 have been able to agree on characterizing China using the infamous triangle of partnership, systemic rivalry, and competition. And Taiwan understands what it means to balance these different views on China at different in different ideational contexts, but also purely from an economic perspective. So even though Taiwan has been pursuing, I would argue successfully, a strategy of de-risking through diversification, which manifests itself in mechanisms such as the New Southbound policy, or mechanisms supporting reshoring for Taiwanese entrepreneurs with capital located in China. There is still a significant stock of Taiwanese investments on the other side of the strait, and there is still quite a lot of trade happening between both sides. So there are a lot of lessons to be learned by the EU from Taiwan in terms of managing these different operationalizations of China as an interlocutor. And even those member states that are often characterized as more China-friendly have identified spaces and acted upon this identification of spaces to engage with Taiwan. And I'm thinking about Hungary here. Hungary has very robust political exchanges with China. Many of them are quite controversial. For example, cooperation between Hungary and China on law enforcement. At the same time, Hungary is one of the main destinations of Taiwanese foreign investment because Budapest has recognized that dealing with Taiwan is a good business deal. And so pragmatism is not a new paradigm for engagements with Taiwan. Once again, it's a foundation upon which we can build. And Stefania has also emphasized the importance of Track 2.0 in engagements with China. I would like to emphasize the importance of Track 2.0 in engagements with Taiwan. These types of dialogues lower the level of sensitivity because China has generally not been averse to exchanges between members of the civil society. But something which is a feature of the Taiwanese policy ecosystem is that the membrane between government, academia, and civil society is extremely porous, which means that engagements with the civil society can often be sort of an intermediate step to delivering the right messages to the Taiwanese leadership. And if I may, just very briefly on Global Gateway, just because I recently concluded a round of fieldwork on the initiative, I would love to have some of your optimism. I think it would be good for me, but I'm not optimistic. I don't think that Global Gateway is dead, but I think that it is very much a rhetorical failure because I think that the EU does not know how to project its own Huayuquan, unlike China. During my fieldwork in Vietnam and in Fiji, I realized that either among like-minded development partners, so Japan, Korea, Australia, and so on, or among local stakeholders, the recognition of Global Gateway as this new vehicle of development cooperation is really extremely limited. And when we talk about the EU in general, I think that we have to understand the EU as an actor in multi-level governance structures. And one development that I have observed recently is that we see emergence of not only supranational structures when we talk about multi-level governance, but also increased quests for actorhood, for global actorhood among regional subnational actors. And China has been extremely skilled at recognizing this dynamic and productively engaging with subnational actors when it matters. So that's why through these subnational engagements and through recognition of the pertinence of these multi-level governance structures, it can be very effective in projecting power through mechanisms such as BRI. So for instance, in Fiji, one of the main interlocutors for China is the Great Council of Chiefs, a body that was established after the most recent constitutional reform in 2013, and that essentially is an assembly of unelected hereditary chiefs from across the archipelago. And then compare it with the way the EU engages not only with the Republic of Fiji, but with the Pacific Island countries in general. One EU delegation to the Pacific based in Suva has to cover 14 countries in the region where connectivity in and of itself is one of the tremendous challenges. So you mentioned the pertinence of institution building for Global Gateway. I think that at least partially the culprit here is the institutional arrangement itself and the fact that Global Gateway is managed by DG INTPA rather than the European External Action Service, because DG INTPA lacks the understanding of these political nuances, which hinders its ability to implement Global Gateway as a strategic tool.
Thank you very much. So I think we can now open discussion to the floor. So I see, okay, this side I see 2 hands. Yeah.
Thank you. What is the role for the United Kingdom in all of this? We've spoken about Europe very much in terms of the EU, but if we look at the role of the UK in fostering dialogue with European actors as a way of either countering China, which the integrated review defined as an epoch-defining challenge to world order. What can the UK do? I mean, you know, we've seen recently the decision by the British government to pay a lot of money to give away the Chagos Islands, but that raises some concern amongst some groups of a potential fear of China-Western strategic competition. So what's the role of the UK in all of this?
Okay, let's take another question maybe.
Sorry, may I ask, what's the role of the UK in the Global Gateway, in the Track 2, okay.
Thank you. I have one observation and a question, particularly whether at EU in general, when it comes to Asia, and not just with some successful sort of workings with Taiwan, whether you have a regular mechanism, aside from some of the international sort of conferences already, that you consult perhaps with Japan and Korea on some of the regional specific issues, such as development cooperation in Asia, Taiwan. I'm asking this because in the past, and particularly when we're going about 20 years ago, EU used to sort of steal the march in certain cases, such as North Korea. They would consult no one here not here, but Japan or South Korea, and suddenly sort of, you know, the whole commission goes to North Korea. And so I was just a little concerned, or not concerned, but interested if since then, perhaps at the EU Commission level, there's sort of maybe regular strategic consultations between some of the other like-minded, obviously, powers such as South Korea, Japan, and in this case, in some cases, ASEAN Secretariat, because I thought that that might be a very good way of propping up. I know that during COVID, during the European Union actually standards for some of the transportation regulations. It's very indispensable for Taiwan because Taiwan was left out from the WHO and China wouldn't let them join. So it was actually the European Union system which actually gave them all the quarantine information, everything. So I thought that, okay, this is something really positive. And institutional, and it's very legitimate and credible. So I thought that if the global gateway isn't getting the traction, perhaps it might be in that way of perhaps consulting regularly with the other, say, donor countries. So thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we can take one more question over there. I think I saw a hand there. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for a fascinating discussion. It was actually a follow-up from a very similar question that was just already asked. In terms of infrastructural development, you actually see a lot of joint funding between AIIB and EBRD. So this is why when you're talking about global gateway and connectivity, the number one thing I thought was, do you actually have sort of these conversations with other donors? Like for example, I work on China and Central Asia, China and Southeast Asia, and China and the Pacific. And the countries that I often hear in sort of parallel with China is basically Taiwan and Japan. So I just wondered, similar to these kinds of AIIB kind of funding, do you have these kinds of discussions with other infrastructural actors in the region? And a second question was really, I think in the beginnings of Belt and Road Initiative, the EU actually was trying to find out a list of projects where they could co-fund with Belt BRI. So they had projects and they were trying to gauge which ones they could co-develop with China. And I think that idea was abandoned and essentially it actually took a trajectory of its own. So given that you had that kind of background, I wondered if I can push you a little bit further and ask, what do you expect from this conversation with China? And I'm just curious, curious because I do know other countries like Japan are having these conversations with China in terms of infrastructural development, and they are getting further ahead in terms of co-investing in specific projects. So I wondered, behind that, what kind of outcome do you have in mind? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think maybe we can start from Mercy this time and do like the other direction. Like, I don't know if you have any of this question that you would like to address.
There is one concrete example of cooperation between the EU and other like-minded partners, including the UK and Japan, which I think sheds some light on the spaces for cooperation that were inquired about in all three questions. So, for example, in Vietnam, the EU and the UK are jointly coordinating the International Partners Group, which is behind an energy connectivity related project in Buck Eye. So, coordinated by these two entities, the EU and the UK, 6 development partners from France, Germany, Italy, and from Japan, represented by JICA, have come together to provide financing for Vietnam Electricity, the national, previously state-owned provider of electricity, to build a new hydroelectric storage facility that aims at stabilizing the local grid and indeed enhancing energy connectivity in light of Vietnam's soaring energy demand and also net zero commitments. So when we talk about Global Gateway, we often talk about the Team Europe approach, where the EU is pulling together resources and expertise also from member states, including their implementing agencies, so bodies such as AFD in France or GIZ in Germany, and also these countries' national development banks, so for example KfW in Germany, and also working together with bodies like EBRD or the European Investment Bank. But I think that there's quite a lot of space for collaboration with third partners, and here Buck Eye is a successful example of such cooperation. Actually, a new memorandum of understanding confirming long-term financing amounting up to 480 million euros was signed just 3 days ago now. So that project is very much happening and illustrates how strategic initiatives that are not only beneficial to donors in terms of infrastructure construction, but also have strategic value, can be implemented between these like-minded partners. In terms of regular consultation mechanisms, I think that at least in the Indo-Pacific, Japan and South Korea emerge as the most telling example. So since 2019, the EU and Japan have had a connectivity partnership that is supposed to be a mechanism for the EU and Japan to collaborate on creating this positive offer of infrastructural development, and the Buck Eye project is actually mentioned as one of the success stories. It was explicitly named as such during the July 2023 EU-Japan summit. And with Korea, there are regular development consultations, and during the most recent consultations, which took place in Seoul in 2024, Global Gateway was mentioned explicitly for the first time in the joint statement, and the EU and Korea are considering implementation of joint projects in Vietnam and in Cambodia, but there are no concrete projects to speak of as of yet. There are some smaller initiatives that the EU is implementing or has implemented with Taiwan that engage third countries. So in the spirit of regulatory connectivity, even though the term is arguably most elusive because it doesn't have a tangible component, the European External Action Service has worked together with the Department of Gender Equality in the Executive Yuan, so essentially the Cabinet Office in Taiwan, for a 3-year initiative aimed towards capacity building in gender mainstreaming, including LGBTQI+ issues, where relevant stakeholders from Southeast Asia were also included.
Thank you. Maybe we can, Stefania, if there's any question that you would like to address.
Thanks. I try to respond to the three of them very, but of course it's not going to be exhaustive, so you can have plenty of comments. What can be the role of the UK? Starting with promoting trilateral conversation, EU, UK, China, as simple as that. Track 2, track 1.5, both of them are good. Track 2 being without officials, track 1.5 with officials. As I said, the feeling really is that there are so few by now, and I'm talking EU institutional. So of course, bilaterally, the member states do have certain channel, but taking EU lenses, we need to do so much more that even starting with that would already be a huge improvement. Speaking about trilateral consultations at strategic level, indeed, in theory, Global Gateway should pave the way for that. Because the theory behind Global Gateway is indeed to have a more equal footing partnership and also to enable cooperation with a large degree of partners as possible. This is where, in my optimism, as soon as possible, when Global Gateway will fully be implemented. A hard deadline, unfortunately, I don't have it. The list of things to do before this happens is indeed a little bit long. And this goes to the third part of, expectations on the dialogue. In terms of specific projects, I would say expectation is not, at least in the immediate term. I also speak for experience in researching cooperation with Japan, with which, of course, it's everything is in principle already agreed because the EU and Japan even have a connectivity partnership. Same goes with India, connectivity partnership. But even if there is strategic alignment and an alignment in objectives, the technicalities are actually quite, when we go down to picking specific projects, of course it gets tricky. Why this one and not that one? Which kind of funding do we use? The mechanism. We would have most likely to imagine a completely different funding mechanism. So that would be the answer to the question for me. Not the current examples that we have in mind, because of course, if we enter into a sort of like how things are right now, it is not possible to have a cooperation there because it is not made for partnership, honestly. Imagining a different way of co-financing, that would certainly be a way of moving forward, but we're not quite there yet. Again, doesn't mean that sitting at the table and having a dialogue on different bases, with different elements, would still be beneficial. So that's the benefit that I see at the moment.
Thank you so much. And then last but not least, Thies. Yeah.
Yes, I'll just answer two of the questions, starting with what's the role of the UK in all this. And the all this, then I will define as what Luc van Middelaar calls le réveil géopolitique d'Europe, the geopolitical awakening of Europe. And I'll try to be very short. There is no, in essence, I think, would be historically naive to expect a geopolitical actor standing up in Europe without at least the support of the UK. And this raises questions about a division of labor between EU institutions, member states, and non-EU member European states. And that's a creative process. I think that's something that's going to be invented. I think the European political community is at once just a talking shop and just another summit, but also perhaps the seedling of this creative effort to create some sort of forum where a European geopolitical identity can be forged. And then self-evidently, perhaps, but very importantly, the UK is there. As Macron and Starmer knew, but in 2012, when the EU was given a Nobel Peace Prize, and all heads of state were there to, together with the EU presidents, actually one head of state wasn't there, David Cameron. He didn't get it, I think. So I think if you're asking what's the role of the UK, there's a difference, or there's a distinction there in understanding that the UK has a constitutive, vital role in any potential effort to speak on behalf of Europe on the world stage, and that Europe not appearing at all. So that's very important, I think. And then perhaps taking your question too broadly, but what's going to happen to the EU-China conversation, and picking up on a comment earlier on this dialogue of the deaf, I think at least there's a, to an extent, something the EU has done or hasn't done to create that dialogue of the deaf, and that's explain itself, right? Not just the what it's doing, you were completely right, also the why it's doing, but also who's doing the doing, who is the EU? I had a very interesting deep conversation with the members of a Chinese think tank a couple of weeks ago, and in the heat of the discussion, the think tank director ended on a passionate plea, explain to us your civilization, which was, I thought, a sort of beautifully Chinese way of saying, explain not just your policies, your norms, your strategies, but your identity in a time where collective identity politics really is very dominant in geopolitics. And the EU is very bad at that. But I think there is a common European identity that we can speak to and speak from, and indeed that transcends the institutions of the Union, but we have very great difficulty in organizing spokesmanship for. So I think if you're talking about where's the conversation going, that's at least the part that the EU needs to do better. It needs to use those opportunities not just to make a trade, but to explain itself as an end in itself. And then I think that would also make that a more predictable relationship to China.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to our panelists for the great discussion. And yeah, enjoy coffee break.